You have to understand, at first, the place was a sanctuary. Not in a spiritual way. I'm a scientist, we don't really do sanctuaries. I mean, it was a perfect, hermetically sealed bubble of work. That's what I wanted. That's what the grant paid for. 3 months of pure, uninterrupted bioacoustic research in the heart of the Everglades. The stilt house the university rented for me was, honestly, nicer than my actual apartment. It was solid, raised high above the waterline on thick concrete pillars with solar panels, a satellite dish, and wraparound screened porches. It was a fortress of scientific reason dropped into the middle of a prehistoric swamp. And I loved it. The first few days were just logistics. Unpacking crates of sensitive equipment, calibrating microphones, setting up the server banks. My world shrank to the hum of the computers and the air conditioner. It was a clean, controlled sound, a human sound. Outside, the glades had their own noise. You'd think a swamp would be quiet, but it's not. It's a constant, layered symphony of life and death. The high-pitched whine of mosquitoes, the deep, guttural belch of a bullfrog that sounded like a loose-stringed cello, the splash of a fish or maybe something bigger. During the day, it was all background noise, a kind of natural white noise machine that actually helped me focus. I was Dr. Anya Sharma, in my element, isolated and productive. Loneliness wasn't a factor. It was a prerequisite. I'd spend the mornings out on the airboat, with a guide at first, then on my own once I got the hang of the channels. I'd place the waterproof, wide-spectrum microphones in strategic locations, some deep in the cypress domes, others in the open sawgrass prairies, a few near the mangrove tangles. My goal was simple, or at least the idea of it was, to create a complete acoustic map of this specific quadrant. To listen to the ecosystem's pulse, to understand its language. The work was methodical. I'd collect the data cards, bring them back to the cabin, and then spend the rest of the day and most of the night processing the files. I'd sit there, headphones on, watching the spectrograms scroll across my main monitor. Green and yellow peaks and valleys that painted a picture of the unseen world. I could identify the call of a limpkin from 100 yards, distinguish the flutter of a dragonfly's wings from a beetle's. It was a godlike perspective, in a way, listening to a world that had no idea I was there. That's how I found the first sound. It was about a week in. I was going through the recordings from Mic 7, which I placed deep in a particularly dense, murky slough. It was a nighttime recording, so it was mostly the insect chorus and the occasional deep bass thump of a bull alligator. Pretty standard stuff. I was about to scrub forward when my ear caught something. It was so out of place that my brain flagged it before I consciously registered what it was. I stopped the playback, rewound 30 seconds, listened again. There it was, underneath the chirps and the croaks, faint but clear. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythm, a pattern. That was the first thing that was wrong. Nature has rhythms, sure, the cicadas, the frogs. But they are chaotic, overlapping, a biological cacophony. This was not. This was deliberate. It had the clean, hard report of a piece of wood striking something hollow. It was completely arrhythmic to everything else happening around it. A metronome in the middle of a free jazz concert. My first thought, of course, was equipment malfunction. A loose wire, maybe? Or water getting into the housing, though these things were rated for submersion down to 50 feet. I isolated the sound, amplified it, and looked at its waveform. It was a clean spike, not the fuzzy signature of an electronic glitch. So, next hypothesis, an animal. A woodpecker? No. I pulled up my reference library. The sound was too low, too resonant. And the timestamp was 2:17 a.m. Most birds aren't working the graveyard shift. Maybe one of those weird snails that taps its shell? I couldn't find any record of it. I ran the audio fragment through every database I had, avian, mammalian, reptilian, even insect. Nothing. Zero matches. I leaned back in my chair, pulling the headphones off. The silence of the cabin pressed in on me, suddenly much quieter than the swamp outside. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I played it again, and again. The pattern was identical each time it repeated, about 20 seconds apart. There were 3 repetitions, and then it was gone. The normal sounds of the swamp just swelled back up to fill the space it left behind. It was weird. It was an anomaly, a data point that didn't fit. But I'm a scientist. Anomalies are part of the job. You don't jump to crazy conclusions. You document, you note the discrepancy, and you wait for more data. My best guess, my most rational explanation, was that a submerged branch, moved by the current, was periodically knocking against the microphone's polycarbonate casing. It was plausible. The rhythm could just be a coincidence of water pressure and buoyancy. It made sense, sort of, so I wrote it down in my log. 2:17 a.m., Mike 7. Anomalous rhythmic tapping. Suspected environmental contact with mic housing. Timbre suggests wood on polycarbonate. Monitor for recurrence. That was it. I closed the file. I labeled it, and I moved on. I had terabytes of other data to get through, and I couldn't let myself get bogged down by one weird little hiccup. It was just a noise. In a place full of noises. For the rest of the day, I was completely professional. I analyzed the migratory patterns of wading birds based on their morning calls. I cross-referenced the intensity of the insect chorus with the ambient temperature and humidity data. I did my job. I forced that little rhythmic sound into a box in the back of my mind, the box labeled, unsolved, probably boring. But it didn't quite stay in the box. As the sun went down, casting long, distorted shadows of the cypress trees across the water, I found myself getting up to check the locks on the doors. I did it twice. I told myself it was just good practice. You're alone, in the middle of nowhere, Anya. Of course you should lock your doors. It had nothing to do with some stupid sound on a recording. I made dinner, a freeze-dried pasta thing that tasted like cardboard and salt. I sat on the screened-in porch, watching the sky turn from orange to a deep bruised purple. The night sounds started to rise again. The frogs, the bugs, the whole symphony warming up for its nightly performance. It was the same soundscape I'd found comforting just the day before, but now I was listening differently. I was listening for something that didn't belong. I was waiting for a single, rhythmic beat to cut through the chaos. It didn't come, of course. I finally called it a night around 11. My eyes were burning from staring at the screens all day. I shut down the main analysis terminal, leaving only the primary server humming quietly as it downloaded the real-time feeds from the active mics. The cabin fell mostly silent. There was just the low thrum of the generator and the faint click of the refrigerator's compressor. I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and got into the small, Spartan bed. I was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired you get from intense mental focus. My mind was a swamp of data, of waveforms and decibel levels. I closed my eyes, ready for sleep to just take me. The low hum of the server was a steady, lulling presence. And then I heard it. My eyes snapped open in the pitch dark. It wasn't on a recording. It wasn't in my head. It was faint, coming from outside, from far away across the water. Tap, tap, tap. My heart didn't just jump. It felt like it seized, like a fist had closed around it. I lay there, completely frozen, every muscle in my body rigid. I held my breath, straining to hear over the blood pounding in my ears. Was it real? Was I actually hearing it? Silence. Just the generator, the fridge, the distant, chaotic noise of the swamp. I waited. 1 minute, then 2. Nothing. Not another sound that wasn't supposed to be there. Slowly, shakily, I let out the breath I was holding. It was nothing. It was my brain playing tricks on me. That's what happens, I told myself. Auditory pareidolia. You listen to a weird sound on a loop for an hour, and then your tired brain starts inserting it into the background noise. It was an echo, a ghost in my own head, not in the machine. I rolled over, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. Get a grip, Sharma, I whispered into the darkness. You're just tired. But it took a very, very long time to fall asleep. And in that long stretch of darkness, I wasn't listening to the symphony of the Everglades anymore. I was listening for the metronome. The human brain is an incredible machine for forgetting. It has to be, right? Otherwise we'd all just be paralyzed by every near miss on the freeway, every awkward conversation, every moment of fear. For a few days, my brain did its job beautifully. It took the memory of that faint, distant tapping and filed it away under auditory hallucination, fatigue-induced. I buried myself in work, in the clean, verifiable data of bird calls and insect choruses. I put in 18-hour days. I exhausted myself on purpose, because a tired mind doesn't have the energy for ghost stories. The swamp went back to being a swamp, a noisy, complex, but ultimately neutral environment. The sanctuary was restored. I even stopped double-checking the locks. It was a Tuesday, I think. Day 12. I'd just finished processing a huge batch of data from Mike 2, a hydrophone I'd sunk in a deep canal, and the results were beautiful. I could clearly distinguish the sonic signatures of 3 different species of gar, just based on their movements through the water. It was the kind of small, perfect victory that makes all the isolation worthwhile. I was feeling good. I was Dr. Anya Sharma, scientist, in full command of her environment. Cocky, in retrospect. That's usually when things go wrong. The next drive in the queue was from Mike 4. I remembered placing that one. It was closer to the cabin, maybe only 300 yards out, placed on a little hummock at the edge of the sawgrass prairie. A less interesting location, acoustically, but necessary for a complete map. I pulled the files, expecting nothing more than wind noise and the rustle of reeds. I put my headphones on, leaned back, and hit play, my eyes half closed as I listened to the familiar sounds of the afternoon. The first hour of the recording was exactly that. Wind, the occasional bird. Then the sun must have gone down, because the insect chorus started to swell. The familiar bass line of the night. I was about to scrub forward to the next morning when my entire body went rigid. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. It wasn't faint this time. It wasn't distant. It was so loud, so clear, it felt like it was happening right inside my headphones. It was right there, at Mike 4, 300 yards away. The sound was identical in rhythm, but the quality was different. Sharper. It wasn't a dull thud against a submerged case anymore. This was a hard, dry, percussive crack. The sound of a stick hitting a dead, hollow tree. There was no doubt this time. No rationalizing it as a branch in the current. This was loud, deliberate, and close. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a panicked drumbeat completely out of sync with the cold, measured rhythm in my ears. The sound repeated. Once, twice. The third time, something else happened. The tapping stopped, and a new sound began. And this sound was the thing that truly broke through my scientific skepticism. It's hard to even describe. It was a hum, a low, guttural, vibrating hum. But it wasn't clean like the generator or an electrical buzz. It was wet, organic. It sounded like the buzzing of 1,000 horseflies trapped in a jar, but pitched down, slowed down, distorted through water. It sounded like someone was trying to imitate the sound of a giant insect, but was doing a terrible job of it, their voice catching and rattling in their throat. It was the most unnatural, natural sound I had ever heard. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the sound of something pretending to be an animal. I ripped the headphones off my head as if they were on fire, my ears ringing in the sudden silence of the cabin. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. My mind, my logical, evidence-based mind, was in a tailspin. Okay, Sharma, think. Data. Cross-reference the data. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to click the right icon. Each microphone was paired with a low-light, motion-activated camera. I pulled up the video feed for Cam 4, scrubbing the timeline until it synced perfectly with the timestamp on the audio file. My eyes were glued to the screen, my heart pounding in anticipation of what I might see. A person? A large animal I couldn't identify? Anything. I needed to see something. The video flickered to life. The camera's night vision painted the scene in an eerie monochrome green. The sawgrass prairie, still and silent. The surface of the water, a flat, dark mirror reflecting a partial moon. The silhouette of a distant cypress dome. The video was completely, utterly still. I played it again, my face inches from the screen. Nothing, not a ripple on the water. Not a blade of grass moving that wasn't stirred by the faint breeze. The timestamp on the bottom of the screen confirmed it. This was the exact moment the tapping and the hideous buzzing were being recorded. The sound of a large stick striking a log. The sound of a monstrous wet hum. It was all happening, audibly, less than a football field's length from where that camera was pointing. Yet, the visual evidence showed nothing but a placid, empty landscape. That was it. That was the moment the floor dropped out from under me. It wasn't an equipment malfunction. Two different microphones, days apart, miles apart? No. And it wasn't an animal. An animal would have shown up on camera. An animal would have disturbed the water, rustled the grass. This was impossible. The sound and the vision, the two pillars of my research, of all empirical evidence, were telling me two completely different stories. And one of them was a nightmare. For the first time since I'd arrived, the cabin didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a fishbowl. A well-lit, air-conditioned cage parked in the middle of something ancient and unknown and, I was now starting to believe, malevolent. I got up from my chair, my legs feeling like they were filled with sand. I walked to the main door, the heavy one made of solid wood. My hand reached out and touched the deadbolt. It was unlocked. I twisted it. The heavy clunk of the bolt sliding home was a shockingly loud, final sound in the quiet room. It didn't feel reassuring. It felt like I was sealing myself in. I went from window to window, checking the latches. They were all secure, of course. This was a new building, designed to withstand a hurricane. But I had to touch them. I had to feel the cold metal under my fingertips and confirm that they were closed, locked, separating me from the vast, dark expanse outside. I stood there for a long time, in the main room with the lights off, just a silhouette against the glow of my computer monitors. I was listening, not to the recordings but to the night itself. Every sound was now a threat. The creak of the house settling on its pillars was a footstep on the porch. The drip of condensation from the air conditioner was someone tapping on the glass. The hum of my own servers was a low, waiting breath. The swamp symphony was no longer a beautiful chaos. It was a curtain of noise, a perfect screen for something to hide behind. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia. It was a physical sensation, like a pressure on the back of my neck. I didn't eat dinner. I couldn't. I just sat at my workstation, the audio file from Mic 4 still open on the screen. I couldn't bring myself to close it. It was the only proof I had that I wasn't going crazy. It was the monster in the closet, and I couldn't look away. Reluctantly, I put the headphones back on, turning the volume down low. I had to listen again. I had to try and understand. I isolated the buzzing sound, filtering out the background noise of the crickets and frogs as best I could. I looped the 5-second clip. VVVVMMM hum hum VMMM. Pause. VVVMMM hum hum VMMM. Over and over, the grotesque sound filled my ears. It was so easy to just dismiss it as terrifying noise. But I wasn't just anyone, I was a bioacoustician. My brain was trained to find patterns in noise. That was my entire job. And as I sat there, forcing myself to listen past the fear, I started to notice something. It wasn't just a random hum. The pitch rose and fell with a specific cadence. It wasn't a melody, not like a song. It was more primitive than that. It was phrased. There was a rhythm to the rasping, a pattern to the distortion. It was like listening to someone trying to hum a tune they'd only heard once, and they couldn't quite remember it, and their voice was broken. It was a deformed melody, a twisted, sick little tune whispered just below the threshold of comprehension. I took the headphones off slowly. The knowledge settled over me, cold and heavy. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. This was an intelligence. And it was out there, in the dark, moving closer. And it was trying to sing. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I even blinked. I just sat at my workstation, the looped fragment of that grotesque humming playing over and over on my desktop, the sound muted. I didn't need to hear it anymore. It was burned into my memory, a permanent scar on the auditory part of my brain. The knowledge that it was an intelligence, that it was trying to mimic something, a song, a call, something, changed everything. The swamp was no longer a neutral space filled with random noise. It was a hunting ground, and the line between observer and observed had been erased. The sun came up. I watched it through the reinforced windows, the soft orange light spilling over the cypress trees, making the mist glow. It should have been beautiful. It should have felt like a reprieve, the monsters retreating with the dawn. But it didn't. All it meant was that I could see the trees more clearly. The trees he could be hiding behind. My scientific mind, the part of me that had been my anchor my whole life, was in a full-blown mutiny. It was screaming for data, for verifiable proof, for anything other than a creepy sound file and a gut feeling of absolute terror. Fear is a useless data point. Paranoia is the enemy of empirical observation. But what do you do when the observation itself is the source of the paranoia? I made coffee, my hands shaking so much I spilled grounds all over the pristine stainless steel countertop. I drank it black and bitter, standing by the window, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just the endless, indifferent green and brown of the Everglades. Okay, Sharma, think. You have one piece of anomalous data, the audio from Mic 4. And you have one piece of corresponding non-data, the empty video from Cam 4. The conclusion is that something made a sound without being visible. That's a contradiction. Contradictions mean a variable is missing. What was the variable? There was only one way to find out. I had to assume my premise was wrong. I had to assume I had missed something. I had to go back to the beginning. I sat down at my central monitor, pulling up the master archive. Weeks of footage, terabytes of data from 5 different camera and microphone pairs, recording 24/7. It was a Herculean task, but I had nothing but time and a gnawing, clawing need to find an answer that wasn't, "There's a monster in the swamp who likes to sing." I had to find the raccoon, the alligator, the weird atmospheric phenomenon that would make all of this make sense again. I started with day 1. Cam 1, MIC1. I put the video on 8x speed, my eyes scanning the monotonous footage. Trees, water, a great blue heron landing, a turtle sunning itself on a log. Speed up, more trees, more water, the shift from day to night, the infrared kicking in, painting the world in ghostly green. Hours bled into one another. My back ached, my eyes burned from staring at the screen, but I couldn't stop. It felt like if I looked away, that's when I'd miss it. This was the part of the job that nobody saw. The unglamorous, mind-numbing grind. The search for a single, significant pixel in a universe of meaningless ones. I watched myself on the footage from the camera nearest the cabin, a tiny figure moving purposefully, setting up equipment, blissfully unaware. I looked so calm, so in control. I felt a pang of jealousy for that woman from 2 weeks ago. Day after day of footage scrolled by. Nothing. The tapping incident from Mic 2 came and went. I scoured the corresponding video from Cam 2 for a full hour, frame by frame. I saw a branch floating by that could have, maybe, if you really wanted it to, bumped against the hydrophone housing, but it wouldn't explain the rhythm. It was a stretch. It was a desperate attempt to lie to myself, and I knew it. I was on day 9 of the archive feed. My focus was starting to fray. I was seeing faces in the patterns of the bark, imagining movement in the swaying sawgrass. I was about to just give up, to accept that I was going crazy, that I'd finally succumbed to the solitude. I was watching the feed from Cam 3, the one I placed deep in a cypress strand, pointing across a narrow channel of dark water. It was late afternoon on the timestamp. The light was golden and lazy. A water moccasin slid silently into the water, leaving a V-shaped wake. The usual stuff. Then it happened. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a flicker. A single frame of pure black in the middle of the sun-drenched feed. It was so fast that at 8x speed, my brain barely registered it. But it did. A little flag of wrongness went up in my exhausted mind. I stopped the playback. My heart started a low, heavy thumping in my chest. I rewound the footage, my finger clicking the mouse frame by frame. There, the sunny image of the cypress channel. The next frame, the image was completely obscured by something dark, textured, and close. The frame after that, darkness. The frame after that, darkness. Maybe 5 frames of total blackness. Then, just as suddenly, the sunny image of the cypress channel returned, exactly as it was before. Unchanged, not a ripple on the water. My mouth went dry. I played the sequence back at normal speed. It was less than a second of real time. A hand, a muddy, dripping hand, slapped directly over the lens. The sheer proximity of it made me flinch, leaning back in my chair. It wasn't just in the frame, it was the frame. An act of deliberate concealment. My breath hitched. Okay, data. Cross-reference the data. My hands were ice cold as I navigated to the audio archive. I found the file for mic 3, synced to the exact timestamp of the video flicker. This was it. This was the moment of truth. I was going to hear it. The humming, the tapping, a voice, something that would finally give this thing a name. I braced myself. I put on my headphones, my palms sweating, and I clicked play. Silence. No, not silence. Not the absence of the weird sounds. It was a true, digital, absolute void. I looked at the waveform on the screen. It was a perfectly flat line. There was no birdsong, no wind rustling the cypress needles, no gentle lapping of the water that had been present just 1 second before and 1 second after. For the exact duration that the hand was covering the camera lens, the microphone had recorded nothing. Zero. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, so horrifyingly brilliant. He didn't just know where the camera was. He knew where the microphone was. The microphone was a separate unit, positioned 3 feet to the left of the camera for stereo imaging, camouflaged against the trunk of a tree. It wasn't obvious. You'd have to be looking for it. You'd have to know what you were looking for. This wasn't a random act. This wasn't some swamp-crazed hermit stumbling upon my gear. This was calculated. He had approached the setup, known that both devices were there, and in one smooth, practiced motion, had covered the lens with one hand and cupped the other over the sensitive microphone, muffling it into complete silence. He had blinded and deafened my surveillance in a single, coordinated move. The sanctuary wasn't just breached. It had been mapped, studied, understood. My technology, my expensive, state-of-the-art shield, wasn't a shield at all. It was a window. And he was on the other side, looking in, learning my methods, using my own tools against me. The humming, the tapping, those weren't accidents. They were messages left on my devices for me to find. He knew I was listening. He wanted me to listen. He was performing for me. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt violated, not just watched, but dissected. My work, my mind, my private little world, it was all an open book to him. I went back to the video file, to that one single frame where the hand wasn't yet fully covering the lens. I blew it up, using the enhancement software to sharpen the pixels. The image was grainy, but clear enough. It was a right hand. Long, impossibly thin fingers. The skin was pale under a thick, caked-on layer of black swamp mud. The mud was dry and cracked in places, like a drought-stricken riverbed, revealing the pallid flesh underneath. There was something unnatural about the length of the fingers, the way the knuckles bent. It was human, but wrong. Stretched. I stared at that hand on my high-resolution monitor, and the last of my scientific detachment shattered into a million pieces. This was real. This was happening. A man with long, muddy fingers was out there in the swamp, and he knew everything about me. Every camera position, every microphone placement. He was smart, patient, methodical. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. I stood up and walked to the main plate glass window, the one that gave me a panoramic view of the bayou. It was full night again. The darkness outside was absolute, a solid wall of black that my brightly lit cabin couldn't penetrate. Before, I had looked out and seen an ecosystem, a complex, beautiful network of life. Now, all I saw were hiding places. I saw the dense stand of mangroves where a man could stand perfectly still and be invisible. I saw the deep, murky water where someone could surface just long enough to watch. I saw the towering cypress trees, perfect vantage points, their branches like shadowy arms reaching for my little box of light. The entire landscape, my beautiful, wild subject of study, had rearranged itself into a tactical map for my tormentor. He wasn't just a ghost on my audio feeds anymore. He had a hand, he had a mind, and he was out there, somewhere in that suffocating darkness, looking back at me. And the worst part, the part that made the air in my lungs turn to ice, was the certain knowledge that he knew. He knew I'd found the hand. He knew I was looking. The game had changed, and he had just made his move. The next day was an exercise in managed paranoia. You have to understand, the feeling was completely different now. Before, it was a mystery, a puzzle in the data that was creepy, sure, but still fundamentally a problem to be solved. An academic curiosity with a sinister edge. But now it had a hand. It had intent. The swamp wasn't just hiding something, it was hiding someone. I spent the daylight hours glued to the monitors, a fresh pot of coffee going stale next to me. The sun shone with an almost insulting cheerfulness, making the water glitter and the sawgrass glow. On the screens, the swamp performed its usual routine. Herons speared fish, an alligator drifted by like a half-submerged log, dragonflies zipped and hovered. It was all so crushingly, terrifyingly normal. And that was the problem. The silence from him was louder than any hum or tap had ever been. It was a deliberate, pointed silence. He knew I was watching. He knew what I had found. His absence was a presence in itself. My scientific mind tried to reassert control, but it was like a general trying to rally an army that had already thrown down its weapons and fled. I told myself I was overreacting. It could have been a poacher, I reasoned, someone who knew the area and didn't want his activities recorded. That would explain his knowledge of the equipment. But it didn't feel right. Poachers are pragmatic. They avoid surveillance or they break it. They don't perform for it. They don't create a symphony of psychological terror using custom-made sounds and perfectly timed silences. They don't leave a single, muddy handprint as a calling card. Every time a branch swayed in a way that looked vaguely human, my heart would try to climb up my throat. Every time a shadow shifted, I'd zoom in, my breath held, only to find it was a cloud passing overhead. I was a wreck. I felt hunted. The cabin, my fortress of reinforced glass and steel, my little bubble of civilization, had started to feel less like a shield and more like a display case. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, turning the water to a dull, bruised purple, the real anxiety set in. Darkness was his ally. It was the canvas he worked on. I did my perimeter check, more out of a need to do something than any real belief it would help. All doors and windows were locked. The security system was active. On paper, I was safer than I would be in most city apartments. But my skin knew better. It prickled with a static charge of pure fear. I decided to try and lose myself in the data again, a last-ditch effort to feel like a scientist and not a character in a horror story. I was at my workstation, headphones off, trying to categorize plant density from satellite imagery. It was mindless, tedious work. That's what I wanted. I needed the world to be boring and predictable again, just for a few minutes. The only sound was the low hum of my equipment and the gentle clicking of my mouse. Then I heard it. It wasn't from the speakers. It wasn't a recording. It was low, almost too low to be sure at first, a vibration I felt in the floorboards as much as I heard with my ears. It came from outside, from the west side of the cabin, the side that faced the densest stretch of cypress trees. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I strained to listen, telling myself it was the air conditioner, the water pump, anything. But I knew what it was. There it was again, a little louder this time. A distorted, guttural, throbbing hum. H-H-H-H-H-M-M-M-M-M-M-M-M-M-M-M. H-H-H-H-H-M-M-M-M-M-M-M-M-M-M. The same grotesque mockery of an insect's drone that I had heard on the audio file. But it wasn't a file anymore. It was live. It was 20 feet away. My blood went cold. He was here, right now. My first instinct, a primal, animal reaction, was to hit the floor. But my scientific training, the part of me that still desperately needed to observe and understand, took over. I needed to see. I had to see. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I were wading through deep water. Every tiny noise I made, the creak of my chair, the soft brush of my jeans against the desk, sounded like a gunshot in the silent cabin. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I reached over to my main control panel and, with one trembling finger, I killed all the interior lights. The cabin plunged into almost total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, ghostly glow of the computer monitors. The sudden blackness was disorienting, but it was also a shield. I was a shadow now, inside my own box of shadows. I crept towards the west window. The blinds were drawn, but they were the wide, 2-inch kind. If I was careful, I could make a crack to peer through. My bare feet made no sound on the smooth, cool floor. I held my breath, my lungs burning. The humming had stopped. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse, filled with the weight of anticipation. My fingers found the cool plastic of the control wand for the blinds. I twisted it with excruciating slowness. A tiny sliver of the outside world appeared. Then another. I pressed my eye to the gap, my breath fogging a tiny patch of the glass. Outside, the moon was nearly full, casting a stark, silver light over the scene. It turned the Spanish moss into skeletal draperies and the surface of the black water into a sheet of polished obsidian. It was beautiful, in a stark, dead kind of way. And he was standing in it. He was at the edge of the water, maybe 30 feet from my window, partially obscured by the trunk of a great cypress. He was just as the hand had suggested, unnaturally tall and thin, his limbs like stretched out things that didn't quite fit together right. He wore dark, ragged clothes that made him blend into the shadows, but his head and hands were pale in the moonlight. He was perfectly, completely still. A statue carved from nightmare. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't trying to get in. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was just standing there, facing the cabin, facing my window. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening, as if he could hear my heart hammering away inside my chest. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. An aggressive act is one thing. You can react to it, fight it, run from it. But this was pure, passive, psychological warfare. It was a demonstration. I am here. I can get this close. You are not safe. I am watching you. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My entire universe had shrunk to that one horrifying, motionless figure standing in the moonlight. The rationalizations, the poacher theories, the atmospheric phenomena, they all evaporated in an instant, revealed for the pathetic lies I was telling myself. This was not random. This was personal. I stumbled back from the window, my back hitting the cool, solid wall of the cabin, and I slid down it until I was crumpled on the floor. My safe little haven, my controlled environment. It was a fishbowl, a glass cage in the middle of his territory. He let me feel safe. He let me build my little walls and set up my little cameras, and all the while, he was just watching, with a patience that felt ancient and utterly inhuman. The humming and the tapping weren't just a performance. They were him tuning his instrument. And I was the audience. The only audience. My hands scrabbled in the dark for the small, heavy weight of the satellite phone I kept on the counter. It was my only link. My lifeline. My fingers closed around its reassuringly solid case. I had to call for help. I had to tell someone. I didn't know what I would say. There's a man standing outside my house, humming at me, but I had to say it. With the phone clutched in my hand like a religious talisman, I risked one last look through the blinds. He was gone. The spot where he had stood was empty. The moonlight shone on the undisturbed water. There was no sound of him running, no splash, no rustling in the undergrowth. He had just vanished, as if he had simply turned and dissolved back into the shadows that birthed him. I stayed there, crouched on the floor in the dark, the satellite phone cold in my sweating palm. I didn't make the call, because suddenly I understood. He hadn't left because he was scared. He had left because he was finished. The point had been made. His goal for the night wasn't to break in or to hurt me. His goal was to make sure I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he could. Anytime he wanted. The game had rules, and he was the only one who knew them. And he had just shown me, with terrifying clarity, that it was his move. Look, when I first saw the weather alert on my tablet, you have to understand, my first feeling was relief. That sounds crazy, I know, but after what had happened, seeing him out there, just standing in the moonlight like some kind of bad dream, a storm felt like an ally. I thought, nobody, not even a lunatic who hums in the swamp, would be out in a Category 1 squall. A hurricane, even a small one, is a force of nature that commands respect. It's the one thing out here that's bigger and scarier than any man. So I saw the red and yellow swirl on the weather map, and a part of my brain, the logical part that was getting smaller and smaller by the hour, said, good. This will keep him away. This will pin him down wherever he holes up. I felt like the world was sending me a bodyguard made of wind and rain. For a few hours, it even felt like I was right. I spent the afternoon prepping. Not for him, but for the storm. It felt good to have a normal, tangible purpose again. I checked the storm shutters, made sure the emergency generator had fuel, and consolidated all my data onto a ruggedized external drive. It was routine, scientific, sane. The sky outside turned a sick, greenish gray, the color of a deep bruise. The wind started to pick up, not as a steady blow, but in these weird, violent gusts that would come out of nowhere and rattle the whole cabin like a giant was shaking it. The first drops of rain weren't drops at all. They were like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the reinforced windows. I made a pot of coffee, the smell of it a small comfort of civilization against the rising chaos outside. I sat at my main console, watching the storm on the radar, feeling a strange sense of security. The cabin was a state-of-the-art research station, built to withstand exactly this. The wind howled, but I was safe inside my little steel and glass box. The power grid was reliable. The backup generator was top of the line. The satellite internet was my lifeline to the world. I was isolated, but I wasn't cut off. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. They died, and with them, everything else. The low, reassuring hum of the servers, the whir of the climate control, the soft glow of a dozen different status indicators, all gone. The cabin plunged into a darkness so complete, so absolute, that it felt like a physical substance. The only thing left was the sound of the storm, which suddenly seemed 10 times louder, a screaming, roaring monster that was no longer just outside, but was now in the silence with me. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Okay, Anya, okay," I whispered to myself, the words swallowed by the noise. "Generator, it'll kick on. Just give it a second." I waited. 1 second, 10, 30. The wind shrieked, and something heavy, a branch, I hoped, slammed against the roof with a deafening boom that made me yelp. The generator did not kick on. The silence inside remained. Panic, cold and sharp, started to prickle at the edges of my rational mind. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight, my hand shaking so badly I knocked it off the desk. It clattered to the floor. I dropped to my hands and knees, sweeping the floorboards in the pitch black, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My fingers finally closed around the cool metal tube. I clicked it on. The beam cut a narrow, trembling path through the darkness. Satellite phone. That was the next step. I grabbed it from its charging cradle, but the screen was dead. The storm, the dense cloud cover and torrential rain were blocking the signal completely. Same for my cell phone. No service. The little icon on my tablet confirmed it. No internet connection. Every link was severed. The storm wasn't my bodyguard, it was his accomplice. It had perfectly and completely dismantled my fortress, stripping away every piece of technology that made me feel safe. It had blinded me, deafened me to the outside world, and trapped me in a black, silent box. I was alone now, utterly and completely alone, and in that moment of pure, animal terror, one little piece of my training actually kicked in. The Personal Locator Beacon, the PLB, it's a small, rugged device for extreme emergencies. You flip a cover, you press a button, and it sends a distress signal with your GPS coordinates directly to search and rescue services. It operates on a different satellite network, a dedicated emergency frequency. It was my last chance. I scrambled to the gear locker, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. I ripped open the door and tore through the emergency supplies until my fingers found it. It was bright orange, heavy and solid in my hand. My lifeline. I didn't know if the signal could even penetrate a storm this dense, but I had to try. With a trembling thumb, I flipped the protective cap and pressed the big red button. A tiny LED light started to blink, a faint, hopeful pulse in the suffocating darkness. I didn't know if it had worked. I didn't know if anyone had received it. All I could do was hope. I slid down to the floor, my back against the locker, clutching the flashlight to my chest like a child. And I listened. The storm was a symphony of violence. The howl of the wind, the percussive drumming of the rain, the groan of the cabin's frame as it fought against the elements. That's when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint at first, almost lost in the roar of the wind, but it was there. Unmistakable. The same rhythmic sound from the audio files. It was coming from the roof. My blood went cold. He was out there. In this. He was on my roof in the middle of a hurricane. The thought was so insane, so impossible, that for a second I thought I was hallucinating. Then it came again, louder this time. Tap, 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 tap. And then, from another direction, from the wall to my left, I heard the hum. H H H H H M M M M M M M M M M. It was distorted by the wind, a guttural, vibrating moan that seemed to seep right through the insulated walls. Tap 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 from the floor beneath me. H H H H H M M M M M M M M M M from the window on my right. It was everywhere. He wasn't in one place. Or it wasn't just him. The sounds were coming from all sides, a coordinated assault of noise that turned the storm's chaos into a very specific, very personal kind of hell. It was like he was playing the cabin itself like a drum, with me trapped inside. The tapping was a frantic, insane Morse code, and the humming was a predatory growl. It was no longer a man outside. It felt like the swamp itself had risen up, given voice by this thing, and was clawing at my sanctuary from all directions at once. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did no good. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, through the walls I was leaning on. It was inside my head. My mind just broke. I started to scream. I don't even know what I was screaming, just wordless shrieks of pure terror, trying to drown out the sounds that were clawing their way in. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it all stopped. The tapping, the humming, everything, gone. The only sound left was the wind and the rain. The silence from him was a physical blow. It was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise had been. The noise was a threat. The silence was a promise. It meant he had finished his overture. It meant he was moving to the final act. I held my breath, straining my ears, listening for anything over the shriek of the storm. My entire world was the small circle of light from my flashlight and the roaring darkness beyond it. Screee. The sound was sharp, loud, and sickeningly close. It was the sound of a nail or a knife, or something hard and sharp being dragged down the outside of the main door. A single, deliberate scratch that cut right through the storm's roar and a straight line into my heart. I couldn't move. I was frozen, my flashlight beam fixed on the heavy wooden door. I saw the doorknob. It was a solid, brushed steel lever. And it started to turn. Slowly, deliberately, with a faint metallic groan, the handle moved downwards. It wasn't a jiggle or a rattle. It was a smooth, controlled motion. Someone on the other side was turning it. That's what finally broke the paralysis. I didn't think. I didn't plan. My body just reacted. I scrambled to my feet and ran, stumbling in the dark, my breath catching in a sob. The only other lock was in the bathroom. I threw myself inside, slammed the thin, hollow core door shut, and fumbled with the tiny, flimsy push-button lock in the knob. It clicked into place with a sound that offered zero comfort. It was a privacy lock, not a security lock. A child could have broken it down. The instant I locked it, I heard it. A sound from the main room. A sound of splintering, cracking wood. A single, explosive crack that told me the main door was no longer a door. It was just a hole. He was inside. I pressed myself into the corner of the tiny, pitch-black bathroom, between the toilet and the shower stall, making myself as small as possible. I switched off my flashlight. I didn't want him to see the light under the door. I didn't want him to know for sure where I was. I held my breath, listening. I heard footsteps. They were slow, wet, a heavy, dragging sound, followed by a wet squelch. Thump, squelch, thump, squelch. He was walking through my lab. My safe space. The dripping water from his clothes made a soft patter on the floorboards, an intimate sound that made my skin crawl. Thump, squelch. The footsteps stopped. They were right outside the bathroom door. I could feel his presence through the thin panel of wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. Please, please, please. Then I heard the hum. It wasn't a roar anymore. It wasn't coming from all sides. It was right there, just inches away from my face, on the other side of the door. It was low, guttural, and horribly, horribly close. A wet, distorted, insect-like whisper meant only for me. The thing about a flimsy, push-button bathroom lock is that it's not designed to keep anything out. It's a suggestion, a polite request for privacy. It's meant to stop a roommate from walking in on you, not a monster who just tore your front door off its hinges. As the metal pin clicked into place, I think on some level one knew how useless it was. A piece of me, the logical scientist part that was now curled into a tiny, whimpering ball in the back of my brain, understood that a single determined kick would splinter this door just as easily as the other one. But it was all I had. I was wedged into the corner, between the toilet and the fiberglass wall of the shower stall. Utter darkness. I'd killed my flashlight, terrified the sliver of light from under the door would be a bullseye. All my senses had narrowed down to one. Hearing. My entire universe was the sound of the hurricane trying to peel the roof off the cabin, and the slow, wet footsteps inside. Thump, squelch, thump, squelch. Water dripped from him, a steady patter on the wood floor that was somehow more violating than the storm itself. That was the sound of the swamp, of the outside, being brought into my sterile, controlled world. He was tainting it. The footsteps stopped, right outside the door. I could feel it. You know how you can just feel when someone is standing near you, even with your eyes closed? It was like that, a pressure in the air, a shift in the density of the darkness. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my own heartbeat a frantic drum against my eardrums. And then, the hum. It wasn't the distorted, wind-tossed moan from outside. This was different. It was right there, inches from my face, separated only by a thin sheet of pressboard. It was wet, low, and guttural. It vibrated through the door, through the floor, and up my spine. It was the sound of 1,000 wasps trapped in a wet throat. It was the most intimate, predatory sound I have ever heard, a secret whisper just for me. My sanity shredded. I think I made a noise, a choked little gasp, because the humming stopped and the doorknob began to rattle. Not just a jiggle. He was trying to force it. The cheap metal of the knob assembly groaned in protest. Clank. Jiggle, jiggle, jiggle. Shunk. He wasn't just turning it, he was yanking it, trying to rip it right out of the door. The wood around the knob started to make a splintering sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself so hard into the corner I thought the wall might crack. This is it. This is the end. He'll break it. He'll be inside this tiny black box with me, and that will be the end. And then I heard another sound. It was faint, battling the shriek of the wind. A low, rhythmic growl that wasn't coming from his throat. An engine. I thought I was hallucinating, my mind inventing a rescue that wasn't coming. It was a cruel trick to play on a dying brain, but it grew louder. WWWWWRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRR through the storm. It was getting closer, a lot closer. The rattling on my doorknob stopped. The silence from his side of the door was absolute. He had heard it too. Dr. Sharma, Anya Sharma, this is Park Ranger Services. Are you in THERE? The voice was a megaphone distorted miracle. It cut through the hurricane like a blade. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. From the main room, I heard a sudden, frantic scrambling. No more slow, deliberate steps. This was panic. Squelch, thump, thump, squelch. The sound of someone running. Then, a loud splash from outside, from where the front door used to be, instantly swallowed by the storm. He was gone, fled back into the churning, black water he'd crawled out of. I was still frozen. I heard the Rangers shouting again, closer this time. I heard their heavy boots on my deck. Ma'am, we see the door is breached. We're coming in. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just sat there in the dark, shaking, listening as they forced their way into my little bathroom. The door didn't splinter this time. The lock just popped with a sad little snap. A beam of a powerful flashlight blinded me, and I flinched, throwing an arm over my face. "Oh, my God," one of them said, his voice soft. "Ma'am, it's okay. You're safe now. We got your PLB signal." They helped me out. I remember being wrapped in a thick, coarse blanket. I remember the dizzying boat ride, the wind and rain still a nightmare, but a nightmare I was now leaving behind. I don't remember anything else until I was in an ambulance. The world came back in flashes of red and blue light and the calm, steady voice of a paramedic. I was safe. I had survived. The next few weeks are a blur of things that are supposed to make you feel better. Debriefings, therapy sessions I mostly sat through in silence. Endless cups of hot tea that other people made for me. I was back at the university. living in a sterile faculty apartment on the 7th floor of a concrete building in the middle of a bustling city. You couldn't get farther from a swamp. I should have felt secure. I didn't. Every quiet moment was filled with the memory of that hum. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that bathroom. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, absolutely certain I could hear tapping at my window. 7 stories up. It was irrational. It was impossible. But the fear wasn't rational. It had bypassed my logical brain and taken up permanent residence in my lizard brain, the one that only knows fight or flight. The official report was useless. Evidence of forced entry. Attacker unknown. Likely a transient or poacher taking advantage of the storm. Case remains open. A transient. A poacher. It was such a neat, tidy box for a horror that felt cosmic in scale. And I knew it was wrong. Transients don't spend days methodically terrorizing a scientist. Poachers don't learn your camera and microphone placements. And they don't hum. That's what I couldn't let go of. The hum, the tapping, the sounds. As a scientist, my life is about data, about analysis, about finding patterns in chaos. The chaos had invaded my life, and the only way I knew how to fight back, the only way I knew how to feel any control at all, was to turn the full force of my professional skills on it. I had to understand it. I had to catalog it. I had to put it under a microscope. The university had given me indefinite leave, but I started going back to my lab at night when the building was empty. The ruggedized hard drive from the cabin sat on my desk for a week before I had the courage to plug it in. All the audio files were there. Hours and hours of the swamp's ambient noise, punctuated by those moments of deliberate, intelligent intrusion. I pulled up the file from that last night. The one recorded from an external mic I'd placed on a cypress tree near the water's edge, just before the storm knocked out the power. I could see the waveform on my screen, a dense, chaotic scribble of the wind and rain. And then, there it was. A cleaner, more defined signal piercing through the noise. The hum. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear, focused. This was just data now. I began running it through a series of filters. Noise cancellation algorithms to strip away the storm. Equalizers to isolate the specific frequency range of the sound. I watched as the tangled mess of the waveform on my screen slowly simplified, the background noise falling away, leaving only the sharp peaks and valleys of the primary signal. I amplified it. I shouldn't have. God, I wish I hadn't. I could have just deleted the file, thrown the hard drive in an incinerator, and tried to live with not knowing. It would have been better to live with the fear of the unknown monster. It would have been a mercy. But I'm a scientist. I had to know. I put on my high-fidelity studio headphones, the kind that block out all external sound. I took a deep breath, and I pressed play. For a second, it was just what I expected. A clearer, cleaner version of that guttural, insect-like vibration. It was unnerving, but it was familiar. But as my software continued to refine it, something else emerged. It wasn't just a random noise. There was a structure to it. A cadence, a rise and fall. It was a melody. A simple, lilting, almost childlike tune. It was horribly distorted, filtered through whatever passed for his vocal cords, but it was unmistakably, unequivocally, a melody. And it was a melody I knew. A cold that had nothing to do with the lab's air conditioning washed over me. It started in my gut and spread through my limbs, turning my blood to ice water. My breath hitched in my throat. It was the lullaby, the one my mother used to sing to me when I was a little girl, when I was sick or scared of the dark. It wasn't a famous lullaby, not one from any book. It was her own version of an old folk song, one she'd changed the melody of slightly, a version that was ours. A secret tune that only existed in the two of us, a piece of musical DNA that belonged to my family, to my most sacred memories of feeling safe and loved. And then, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. A memory floated up from the first few, peaceful days at the cabin. Me, alone, focused on my work, content, and humming. I had been humming to myself without even realizing it. The same tune. I had been humming my mother's lullaby. I ripped the headphones off my head and threw them across the desk as if they were on fire. I stared at the silent waveform on the screen. A meaningless squiggle of green light that contained the absolute destruction of my world. He hadn't just been watching. He wasn't some random lunatic. He was a listener. He had sat out there in the dark, for days, listening to me. He had listened to me talk to myself. He had listened to me work. And he had listened to me hum the most private, precious memory I had. He had learned it. He had memorized it. And then, in the heart of the storm, in my darkest moment of terror, he had sung it back to me. He had taken the one thing in the world that meant safety and turned it into a weapon. The threat was never random. It was a violation so personal, so deeply intimate, that it made my skin crawl and my soul ache. I shut down the computer, but the screen didn't go black fast enough. For a moment, I saw my own reflection. A pale, hollow-eyed stranger staring back at me. I could still hear the tune. It wasn't coming from the headphones anymore. It was playing on a loop inside my own skull. I had escaped the Everglades. I had survived the storm. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like a fatal disease, that I would never truly be safe again. The listener was still out there, somewhere. And he knew the song of my soul.